Thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Roger Wagner to you all, who is going to talk tonight about his paintings. I think you will agree that the gallery looks like it has never looked before. It's a really stimulating synergy between Stanley Spencer and Roger's own works. Those of you that know me well know that I am often quite sceptical about contemporary interventions in museums, and very often they don't work. And I must say, even until the last minute, I was slightly apprehensive about how this exhibition would work and how these paintings would sit together visually. And I think it's a triumph, not only visually but intellectually. I think the artists work incredibly well together, and it's been a real honour to work with Roger this past year. I'm going to hand over to him. He will talk for a bit, and then we'll have a short conversation about his thoughts on Spencer. So over to you, Roger.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here. I'd have probably done a bit more preparation if I knew so many people were coming. But what I thought I would do is, rather than talk about the exhibition, I thought I'll begin just by talking about the pictures that I've got there. And then, as Amanda was saying, we'll talk a bit about how the pictures work together in the exhibition. But the pictures that I've got in the exhibition come from almost sort of 40 years of painting. So I thought it might be helpful just to go through them, as it were, chronologically, not as they're hung in the exhibition, but just to take you through how and when I sort of painted them, and then that'll give you a little bit of an idea, perhaps, of how my work has evolved, and then it'll perhaps be easier to talk about how that's sort of sitting with Stanley Spencer's work in the gallery. So I thought this is the first picture in the exhibition, and it's by far and away the first picture that the earliest of all the pictures that I painted. Just after I'd left school, I went to Italy and sort of spent time looking at Renaissance paintings, and particularly looking at Fra Angelico's paintings, which are it was really my sort of first. They had particularly the Convent of San Marco had an enormous impact on me, and I saw those pictures, and I went to Venice and saw the Guggenheim collection, which is my sort of first real introduction to modernist paintings, and particularly there was a wonderful De Chirico, which had a huge impact on me. And as we were coming out, we just saw a little De Chirico exhibition, and we went in and we were told that Lemaitre was coming and would we like to meet him, and we did. And that had that was the first real artist I'd ever sort of met, and it was De Chirico was actually a almost exact contemporary of Stanley Spencer. He was a little bit older, but he lived into his 80s, and so that had a very big impact on me. But I was going up to Oxford to read English, and I was sort of full of T.S. Eliot's poetry, and particularly a poem called Ash Wednesday, which it's a poem that he wrote just when he was sort of converting to Christianity, and so it's a full of it begins about sort of turning again, and it's a very mysterious poem, but it has within it this little line: "Lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day." And he goes on to sort of think of himself as the bones which the leopards have been devouring. But I remember coming back with my head sort of full of all these different paintings, and suddenly thinking of that line, and suddenly sort of seeing it as a Fra Angelico painting or a De Chirico painting or something like this. And I'd never really done any painting before. And so I immediately then started trying to paint this picture, and I thought the first thing to do would be to go to the zoo, because I didn't really know what leopards looked like. And so I got a season ticket to the zoo. And this was in the 1970s, and it was just, they had the sort of lion house that I had remembered as a child, where all these sort of poor creatures sort of paced up and down in tiny little cages, but they'd replaced that with these big sort of open spaces, and instead of bars, they had great panels of glass. And the first time I went, it's on a sort of top of a little sort of hill in Regent's Park, the lion enclosure, or the leopard and the tigers. And I walked up these sort of steps, and I looked down through this great panel of glass where I could see the sort of tiger about 100 yards away. And I thought, that's a very big tiger. And the tiger looked at me, and it obviously thought, that's lunch, because it suddenly streaked up and they move extremely fast, tigers, and it came rushing towards me. When it was just about, in the second row there, it leapt off the ground and came flying through the air and went, and it was like a kind of Tom and Jerry cartoon. It sort of slid down these great sort of muddy footprints. So anyway, that was a quite sort of dramatic moment. But I went on painting this, and I sort of painted it all the time. I was an undergraduate, and I did sort of a couple of versions, or at least this was the second version, and then went on painting it when I was a student at the academy. And finally I sort of finished it, and it was actually the first sort of oil painting that I ever sold. So this was... So in the exhibition, we put it alongside the Stanley's picture that he did when he was at the Slade. So it just made a nice sort of beginning. So that is certainly much the earliest of the paintings. This is when I was born. My parents bought a sort of holiday house in Aldborough in Suffolk, and so the Suffolk landscape has always meant a huge. Has really influenced all my paintings. And when I was just growing up, the Sizewell nuclear reactor was being built, so we would go and sort of watch it arising from the ground. And at a certain point, I remember when the pylons were installed, and they were kind of marching over the countryside. And I liked it'd been the reactor, but the pylons suddenly seemed to be despoiling the whole countryside. And at that point, I rather turned against them. But anyway, when you go to Sizewell, it's been decommissioned now, but it used to emit this kind of rather sinister hum, and there was something about the sort of the cornfields around it, and which kind of gave off one message, and then this sort of strange shape behind it, and for some reason it put me in mind of the story in the book of Genesis, where you have the angels who come and have a meal with Abraham just before the destruction of the cities of the plain. And so you get this rather kind of pastoral scene with this sort of terrifying sequel. So this was, and for some reason this kind of picture emerged in my mind. And years later, I wrote a poem about it that goes like this. A fête champêtre apocalypse, beneath a day-bright sickle moon, a moment in the flow of time, a picnic on the edge of doom, a blue and endless afternoon, a grace unchanged since time began, a moment in the flow of time, the angels talking with a man, white steam from the reactor's core, our motives burn within our soul, a moment in the flow of time destroys the world or makes it whole. So then that was Suffolk. Well, if we go on to the next one, this is, this, believe it or not, is actually Oxford. I went up to Oxford to read English, and we were, in my last year, we were living in Jericho, a little sort of, just on the edge of Port Meadow in Oxford. And at that time, there was an extraordinary ironworks there, Lucy's Ironworks, which is sadly now gone. But when we were undergraduates, if you walked, it's just along the canal, and when you walked there at night, you'd see the furnaces reflected in the canal. It was a very sort of dramatic space. And that last picture, the Abraham and the Angels, I did an exhibition at the Aldeburgh Festival, and I'd heard that they were going to be performing Benjamin Britten's Burning Fiery Furnace, and so I thought I would do a Burning Fiery Furnace picture to go there. And I got in touch with the Lucy's ironworks and asked if I could have a tour. So this was a photograph I did actually in the ironworks, and the next one is another one. If we have the next, yep. And then I sort of put all these together and did. No, I've gone too far. There we are. That's it. So that was the Burning Fiery Furnace, where there's in the story the three Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are sort of thrown into the burning fiery furnace, and the Nebuchadnezzar servant says, they aren't being burnt, and there is a fourth there who is with a face like a son of the gods. And in the Britten opera, which is a church opera, that's just an absolutely magical moment where you have the three of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are singing the Benedicite, which all ye various things of the Lord, bless ye the Lord. And then you get this treble voice of the angel just rising above them, and it's absolutely kind of spine-tingling moment. Anyway, so that was the picture that I did of that. And while I was doing that exhibition in Aldeburgh, there's from Snape, Maltings, where a lot of the Britten concerts happen, there's a road that goes from there to along the River Ald to Icon Church, which has always, I don't know, for some reason, it's just always been very sort of special to me. And the first time I ever did an oil painting, I'd had this little box of oil paints, and I asked if I could be put down there one evening, or late afternoon, and then I was collected a couple of hours later, and I'd been trying to sort of paint a tree in the middle of that field, and I'd completely failed. It was a total disaster, my picture, but for some reason it actually inspired me just to want to go on doing it and to make it better. And years later, I just happened to open a gospel and read the words in one of the parables, which says the harvest is the end of the world and the reapers are angels. And it's just an explanation of the parable of the wheat and the tares. But I suddenly saw that field with the sort of angels in it. It was in my head, and I'd done very little painting. The leopard's picture was almost the only oil painting that I'd done. But that kind of image remained with me, and so I did a version of it. I don't know if I started it when I was a student, but I was certainly, when I came back to Oxford after that, I was working on an early version of that. And then when I was doing the exhibition in Aldeburgh, I suddenly realised you could actually do a large version of it. And I was going to be doing an exhibition at the Ashmolean, and I thought to have a really big picture would be wonderful. And so I spent... Again, I really didn't know how to do a big picture, but it was tremendous fun finding out. So that was the... I made little sort of plasticine figures of all the angels and sort of shone lights on them. And I managed to borrow there was a wonderful ironmonger's that had sort of made scythes, and they lent me a scythe. So I sort of bicycled back with this sort of scythe over my shoulder, like death on a bicycle. But that was the picture that came from that, and that was I later sort of wrote a poem about it, which is that one, which I went. I don't know how many people came to the poetry reading. A couple. So I'll read one more, but I won't read that poem. But I'll maybe read one more poem at the end, and that's just a detail of the painting. So these are. Three pictures upstairs. There's a little book that's over on the table there, which I can't quite, to be honest, remember how this was started, but there's a wonderful story that in the Book of Kings, which I came across, which is it just seemed tremendous. It's probably a story of the earliest ever recorded pilgrimage, and I did a whole series of little paintings about it. So it's a story about Elijah who had a huge kind of success, and then seems to have had a kind of nervous breakdown, and he goes and sits in the desert and wants to die. And he asks God if he can die. And then an angel, while he's sleeping, comes and makes breakfast for him, which I think is a very nice thing for an angel to do. And he wakes him up and tells him to eat. And then he tells him to go. He goes to sleep again. And then the angel wakes him up and tells him that he's going to go on a long journey. And so you have this... he sort of walks from one end of Israel to the other, and this was the sort of picture of him walking. And finally, after this sort of long journey, he comes to the mountain of God, and there's a storm, but God isn't in the storm. And then there's an earthquake, and God isn't in the earthquake. And then there's a fire, but God isn't in the fire. And then finally, he hears a still small voice, or a silent voice, you might translate it, and he comes out of the cave, and God says, "What are you doing here?" Which is but I just found it very interesting story, and so these were little sort of pictures on which were done in acrylic. It was the first time I'd really tried painting in acrylic, and they were done on rather wonderful Nepalese paper that I found, which gave it a really nice sort of coloured background. So I did some large versions of these as well, but I made them into a little book which was called A Silent Voice. I said we lived in, or at least I had holidays in Suffolk, but I was brought up really in Chelsea, and this is the sort of Thames with obviously Battersea Power Station as it used to be before its recent renovation. These wonderful cranes which have sadly gone now, and it was a walking on water picture. I just somehow I've always been fascinated by that story of I've done sort of several versions of it, which was the story of there's a storm and Peter is all the disciples are in the boat and they see Jesus walking on the water, and they think he's a ghost, and Peter says, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. And so he then has to sort of step out onto the water. And then he begins to sink. And it's just a fascinating, again, just a very sort of symbolic sort of story, which I did, this is one version of it. I did actually quite a lot of versions of it. And I didn't think it really occurred very much in Christian iconography. I thought it would be a wonderful story to use, but there were very few versions of that, hundreds and thousands of sort of mothers and children, but none of this. So I thought, until I went to this place in Syria, which is a place called Dura Europos, which was sort of excavated in the 1930s. And when they excavated it, they found this building. I always like this photograph. It makes me look, I think, like Indiana Jones. But I'm sort of standing in the doorway of what is actually the earliest church that's ever been excavated. It's about sort of 250, because the whole place was destroyed and buried underground in that year. And in it, they discovered this church building with these extraordinary wall paintings, which took me a long time to then discover where they were. It turned out they had gone to Yale, and they weren't on show anymore. And there was a huge warehouse, which actually where you could go and see. Well, I managed to get into. Made me feel even more like Indiana Jones, actually. But and this is Jesus and Peter walking on water. So it was very extraordinary to discover that's as far as I know the earliest picture of Jesus that's ever been found, and you can just see the boat in the background. So anyway, that was that rather encouraged me to go on with this theme, and you can't really see it there, but that church is just that whole sort of town is just next to the Euphrates, and there's a wonderful sort of poem, a contemporary poem, which kind of sees that walking on water happening on the Euphrates. So I thought it would be nice to put it on the Thames. And there's also that wonderful Francis Thompson poem, which talks about Jacob's ladder pitched twixt heaven and Charing Cross, and seeing Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret but Thames. So that was that picture. So this is a. Well, I now live in. This is sort of coming forward a bit. I live in Oxford, in Iffley, which is a little kind of village on the, which is sort of become part of Oxford, but is still a village there. And it has a wonderful 12th century church. This was a working drawing I did for a window that I was asked to do in the church, and I just thought it goes very nicely alongside the chapel window there. In fact, until the exhibition was about when the first time we looked to see what pictures might go there, I hadn't really thought this drawing was just rolled up in in my sort of studio, and I hadn't. It was all tattered, and so I kind of repaired it a bit to put it there. But this is the church, which is an absolutely glorious church in Iffley, which a lot of people in Oxford don't really know about because it's rather sort of tucked away. But it's one of the it's just a fantastic building. And it had in it this John Piper window, which was he'd done for an exhibition, but his family wanted it to go into this church, and it eventually did. But the other window was blank, and so I was asked to do a window to sort of sit opposite the John Piper window. And because there was a sort of font down below it, they wanted a window that would sort of relate both to the John Piper window but also to the font. So it's kind of a sort of the baptistry of the church. And so I did this little, this was a little, a sort of small little painting that I did, which was a sort of rather sort of strange image, but it just sort of developed as I was sort of sketching it with a sort of flowering tree with, And this was this is my studio, and you can see this was the picture that's in the gallery now. I was the technique of making stained glass. Well, there are various techniques, but the technique I was using, which I was taught by a wonderful stained glass maker called Tom Denny, is incredibly complicated. It involves sort of putting wax resists on flashed glass and then sort of aciding it off, and then having sort of two layers of glass with different colours on it. So it's a very complex process. So I really needed to have the full scale version of it in front of me while I was doing that. But it was a fascinating process. So this was the window being installed in the church, and that's the final window, which I always like sort of framing pictures. It's but I don't think I'll ever get a better frame than that. I think that was pretty good. And these are just some of the details, which. There's a wonderful sort of snake's head fritillaries in a meadow just by the church, so I wanted to get them into the picture. That's just another. There's a poem that I wrote with it, but again, I won't. That's the. You never quite know when the thing about aciding is that it kind of eats through, and you can't really. You're not entirely in control of the process. So it's a. I mean, for me, it's quite nice because my temptation is always to try and control things a bit too much, and with this, you just have to see what it does and then work around whatever it produces. And yeah, that was one of the. I was told I got the fish swimming in the wrong direction, so I had to sort of change them. I was also, when I'd finished it, I did a new cover for the font with a friend, Nicholas Miner, who's done some sculpture in the, that's the last verse. So this is the last picture it's the second picture in the exhibition, but it's the most recent of the pictures in the. And it's actually a study for a really big picture that I was asked to do I was asked to do a picture on the entire book of Revelation, which, as you can imagine, is pretty sort of tall order. And it took me about a year to think whether that was even possible to do. But eventually it occurred to me that the book of Revelation is really a poetic sort of book, and the last thing you want to do is to try and illustrate that literally. So as soon as I saw that, then I realized I could actually use my own images to illustrate it. So I wanted the idea of Babylon and the New Jerusalem to be there, and I wanted the lion and the lamb and the sort of that. So this is the big picture that's a. That was forward. So you can see the lamb in the foreground and the lion at the back, and the sort of Babylon it's actually the Port Talbot Steelworks, but which is just there's a wonderful sort of body of water in front of it, and so I could then do the New Jerusalem, which you kind of see reflected in the water, which at the end of the Book of Revelation is sort of coming down out of heaven. That's just another detail, and those are the detail of the prisoners, and that's the lamb. And then the idea is that the sort of prisoners who are being sort of released from their chains in the foreground appear again in the background with the angels and the lion. Well, maybe I'll just finish this by, as not many of you came to the poetry reading, I'll redo when I'd finished the whole painting, I wrote a sort of poem about it. The picture is called sort of Sacred Allegory. and so the poem is called something of the same. So I'll just go to the final. Yeah, so those are the angels with the figures, and that's yes, you can see the lion a bit better there, and that's so here. This is, I'll just read that, and then we'll finish. I travelled roads from east to west, and passed a mighty city where 1,000 arc lights lit the ground, and smoking chimneys choked the air. I saw there, in a prophecy, as an unending city-state, an empire that engulfed the world. Its name was Babylon the Great. In that great city no birds sing, and in its streets no seed can flower. There steel and concrete have one theme, whose only currency is power. There none know what they serve, or why, or with their choices what they choose. But each choice is a zero sum, where if I win, then you must lose. And that iron law twists every choice, and binds each soul with chains of iron. Its walls of iron ring every land, and seal off every road to Zion. But standing there upon the shore, I thought I saw the Lamb of God, a sacrifice already slain, with whitest wool stained red with blood. And as I saw that powerless Lamb had suffered all that power could do, a breath of life breathed through the land, by which the whole world was made new, as with forgiveness, mercy, grace, the math of zero sum unwound. From wretched captives, naked, blind, the chains of iron fell to the ground. Not iron, but angels held our hand, as stepping by a crystal sea, within a figured dance they find an order in which all are free. Then all equations were reversed. The Lamb of God became a lion. The walls of iron were broken down, and pilgrims thronged the paths of Zion. And mirrored in that crystal sea, I saw the New Jerusalem, its walls and trees and shining towers, both here and now, and still to come. So, there it is.
Roger, I think you are as accomplished as a poet as you are as an artist, which I think is a rare thing. I don't think William Blake achieved that. I think his poems are rather better than his pictures, in my opinion, so you're one up on him. I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the artistic process. I was very interested to hear you say that you hadn't really learnt how to use paint. And Stanley Spencer was the same, in that he went to the Slade and trained as a draftsman, and his entire artistic practice was founded on drawing, squaring up for transfer in a very sort of classical tradition. And in that way, you are clearly quite similar. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about your artistic process. Are you a mad sort of draftsman, and do you square up your canvases in the same way that Stanley did?
No, I've never squared things up, but I do especially with big pictures. I mean, with small pictures, I just work sort of straight on the thing. But with the large ones, I always do sort of full cartoons, I just tend to do them on sort of tracing paper and use sort of charcoal and sort of transfer from that, because I like, particularly with big. I mean, not all pictures will work as large pictures, but those that have got something that will somehow work, I find I want to. I've always loved. I mean, as well as Fra Angelico, Piero della Francesca has been a sort of huge influence, and that kind of geometry that he uses, I've always liked getting that into the sort of big compositions. So when I sort of do the sort of cartoons, I've also got all my sort of golden section sort of diagrams and things out. And,
I've noticed that particularly in your Reapers painting, the way you have managed to divide the composition sort of horizontally and vertically. I mean, it's beautifully organised. I mean, there's real skill there.
Yes, well, yes, I mean, I always loved really well composed pictures, and that just seem as if somehow everything is meant to be there. And so that's always been a sort of aim in the sort of bigger compositions that I've done.
And I should add that Piero della Francesca was equally important to Stanley, and in particular the Nativity in the National Gallery. And I think you can really see, especially in his early work, Piero's use of these tonal blocks of colour. I think less so the geometry, but the application of paint and this very sort of tonal way of painting.
Yes, I mean, you don't really see that in the pictures that I've got in the exhibition, but I've been, in recent years, I've been moving to using more sort of tonal and sort of less colours in some of the pictures, so that there's up in Bishop Auckland, where there's a kind of small sort of permanent collection of my pictures. There's some pictures there which are, quite similar in tone to quite a lot of the Pieros.
Actually, it's funny you should mention that, because I was looking at your body of work, or at least what I know of it, and looking at how your technique has progressed, and looking at Ash Wednesday and this very sort of almost surreal composition, and sort of very soft use of colour, and quite tight in its application of paint. And I feel you've sort of loosened up a bit. Stanley was the opposite. He tightened up as he went along, but I feel you've become more painterly as you've gone along. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that was almost. Yes, I mean, it's interesting that Stanley didn't go in, because that's a fairly sort of common trajectory of sort of painters, sort of to start very tight, and as you get a bit more confident as you get older, to get sort of looser and things. And I certainly have done. But there may be still a way to go. I shall probably get very loose when I get older.
There's a wonderful photograph in the exhibition catalogue of you painting in is it a yukata, one of these Japanese?
Oh, right, yes, yeah.
And I had to stop myself from having a picture of Stanley with his pyjamas poking out the bottom of his suit. But you don't seem to go that far.
Not
or
quite,
do you?
not quite.
We can't let this conversation pass without talking about John Donne. And one of the key pictures in the exhibition is Stanley's painting of John Donne arriving in heaven, which is on loan from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And Roger famously has spoken about seeing this picture at the RA in 1980 in the monographic exhibition on Spencer. And you said something along the lines of you saw this painting and you felt that your lives were on a parallel path. Have I got that right, roughly?
Yes, it was, I mean, I can very distinctly remember going up and seeing that exhibition, because we sort of kind of worked down in the sort of bowels of the building, but in those days you could go up through what was then the library, and we got into all the exhibitions free, which was wonderful. So we can, and I suppose I had seen Stanley Spencer before, but certainly this was my first sort of big exposure to him, and those were the first pictures which I loved, but as it went on, I felt at the time there was lots that I really didn't like, and I really thought this person is trying to do what I'm want to do, but he's doing it in completely the wrong way. And so for years I had quite a sort of love-hate relationship, but gradually, Spencer, as I've seen more, and particularly when I went to the Sandford Chapel, the Sandham Chapel for the first time, I realised what a great painter I'd sort of seen that, but I hadn't. Obviously, that hadn't been in the exhibition, and the resurrection had been, so he's become more and more important, really, to me as the years have gone on.
Dare I ask what you make of his nudes?
Well, it depends which ones, really. He always paints incredibly well. He just was a fantastic draftsman. And he was a sort of complex man and had a complex life, and this comes over in the paintings sometimes. So time to go, I think. So anyway, saved by the screen.
Yeah, totally sad. Going back to John Donne as a poet, he was obviously incredibly important to Spencer, and he spoke about, the world in a grain of sand, which for me sums up Spencer's work to some extent. Through Cookham, one has this sense, this macrocosmic sense of what the world means, and this huge sense of Spencer's own personality and these big issues like, religion and love and hope and all these things. And I know that metaphysical poets are equally important to you, and in particular George Herbert. And we had one. George Herbert was originally, his words were going to provide the title of the exhibition, Heaven in Ordinary, but we changed it to John Donne because of the Fitzwilliam picture, which made sense. But perhaps you could tell us a bit about the importance of George Herbert to us.
Well, he's been hugely important to me as a more from the. He did this book called The Temple, which is, I can't remember how many poems there are in it, but every poem is in a different form. And we just happened to have an ancestor who had an early copy of this, which is sort of beautifully printed and beautifully, every sort of page is has got these wonderful red lines on it. And when I did the first poetry book that I ever produced was a wonderful place called the Printmakers Cooperative in Oxford, and they had one of the old OUP treadle presses, and so I decided to make a book to sort of print it myself and do all the sort of hand setting and set my poems alongside these and kind of model it on George Herbert's on what his books sort of looked like. So yeah, he's had a sort of huge impact in that way. I suppose there's something in the idea of metaphysical poetry. It's sometimes defined as a sort of yoking. I can't remember who this was. It was Johnson or someone defined it as sort of yoking together very disparate ideas, and that's something that I've always has been important to me as a sort of painter. That I've just loved when occasionally sort of things sort of click together, which you wouldn't think necessarily belong together, like sort of Battersea Power Station and Walking on Water. I've sometimes, people have asked me what sort of painter I am, and I've never really known how to answer that question, but I think a sort of metaphysical painter would be perhaps the closest I could get.
Well, I hope you will all agree that I think both Stanley and Roger have a unique artistic and spiritual vision, and which sets them apart from their contemporaries. And I find this, this juxtaposition incredibly beautiful and stimulating. I wanted to just ask if anyone had any questions for Roger. Amy.
Roger, you're a painter and a poet, and you've talked about the process of both being inspired to paint from text, but also writing poetry in response to your own paintings. Is one of those, do you feel like you are more of a painter than a poet, or more of a poet than a painter, or are you kind of ambidextrous in the visual languages?
I started painting long before I started writing poetry, and so I'd always, but I suppose I had written some poetry at school and sort of things, but I think I'd always felt that I mean, ever since I'd sort of seen those Fra Angelico pictures, I thought that was kind of what I was going to do. I was going to be a painter. And the poetry started almost sort of accidentally alongside it. I was just, when I started painting, I was also doing some teaching, and I was going to be teaching English literature. So I thought I needed to, if I was going to teach Shakespeare sonnets, I needed to try one out. And I wrote one, and I thought this is actually rather good. And so, and that is actually the sort of Seraphim poem. And so I thought, and it kind of went on from there. But I did that first book of poetry. I did 2 books, which I sort of printed myself, and but at the time, I approached 1 or 2, publishers to see if anyone would be interested, and no one was even remotely interested. It was very different than the kind of poetry that was that was fashionable at the time, and so I sort of stopped writing poetry and didn't start again really until I made The Window, when suddenly I felt it just sort of inspired a poem. And I wrote a poem about the window, and then one poem followed another, and that then sort of led to a book, and a publisher was interested in it. And so that has sort of started me writing poetry again. So it was about 30 years gap, as it were. So now I do both, and but I think painting is still, what I do every day. Poems come along now and then.
Any more questions?
Yes, mine's about painting and poetry as well. I mean, it's obvious from what we saw today, and I have to apologise, I haven't yet seen the exhibition, but your painting and your poetry enrich each other. That's very clear. That last painting that was up there, I was kind of looking at it and thinking, that's amazing, that's a reflection. And I thought, no, it's not quite a reflection. And then I could hear you saying, it's the New Jerusalem, which suddenly explained it. And it's like the whole thing exploded in a really positive way. So that was a great experience. But then I'm wondering, how closely do you keep your paintings and your poetry together? Are they always, presented together, or do they go off on their own journeys?
Well, the paintings probably do sometimes. So there are quite a lot I haven't. There's all kinds of sorts of paintings that I haven't shown. The portraits and landscapes and all kinds of other sort of things that I do, which I don't usually don't often give rise to poems. But the poems, when I did that first book, there was a lovely man called Peter Levy, he was a professor of poetry at Oxford at the time, and he was a huge encouragement to me, actually, because he really responded positively to the poetry. But he said that he advised me to always try and keep the pictures and the poetry together, And that seemed to me actually really good advice, because it just, I mean, it wouldn't be for everyone, but it was for me. And so I've just got a sort of new book of poetry that will be coming out, and some of the poems don't have pictures connected with them. And have just gone off, started, as you say, going off by themselves, and that may happen, more in future. I don't know. The nice thing about that is you never really quite know where things are going to take you, and because I certainly don't plan them. I mean, I had no idea that picture was going to arrive like that, and I didn't know the poem was going to. So I'll wait and see. It'd be interesting to discover.
Say that you spoke about seeing the ironworks in Oxford at night glowing red, and you showed photos of it glowing and red, and then you did a lovely picture, but
there's no red.
I just wondered why. I mean, presumably during the daytime it didn't look red. But...
Yes, no, it did. It's a funny. I mean, you that first picture that I showed you with the Ash Wednesday had quite a bit of sort of pink in it, certainly, and I've done again. Didn't really show you here, but when I was in Syria, there are lots of paintings which I've done, which have got more sort of red in them. The English landscapes don't on the whole have very much red, so they haven't featured, and partly because of that, I've not. It's funny that some composers find particular key signatures work for them and others don't. And I would like to explore red more than I do, but certainly when I painted that picture, partly I was doing it on blue paper, and I just couldn't. I did try it with a strong red in it, and it just didn't work at all. And so I made it. So again. It may well be that in the years that are left to me, I will suddenly start doing violent red paintings and surprise everyone.
The red light has slightly hellish overtones as well. I think the white light is more sort of
yes, there was that.
Spiritually uplifting.
There was partly that. Yeah.
Thank you, Roger, for a beautiful presentation. And I was interested in your comment about the walking on water theme not being represented very much in art, and wondered, especially with what you were saying about Suffolk, whether you are aware of Maggie Hamling's Good Friday Walking on Water, which is a slightly different gospel passage about Jesus appearing on the waves. But she paints it in memory of her late mother, and the Methodist Church bought it for their modern art collection.
Oh, did they? No, I haven't seen that yet. I must look that up.
Peter Howson, which is much more the Peter-Jesus encounter, which has also been bought for that collection. So I wondered what the date of yours was, and whether there was any sort of common period in which these were inspiring these artists, yourself and the others.
Yes, I can't now remember what the it'll be in the book somewhere what the date of that one was. I don't think they had. I mean, the last time I saw the Methodist collection, they didn't have that. I don't think those had been there, which is actually the first time I met Unity was at the Methodist collection, but because they haven't got a Spencer picture there either. And but no, I'd be really interested to see those actually, because obviously I know both their work, but I haven't seen those particular pictures. So thank you for telling me about those. I shall.
I'm going to look that up straight
away. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, Stuart.
Can I just congratulate you, Amanda, and Roger for a wonderful exhibition and a beautiful talk. So thank you very much indeed. Italy is one of our favourite places that we go to. We think the church there is an absolute jewel. So fabulous to meet you and know who did the window there. So we always go in April when the fritillaries are out in the meadows there.
Yes,
it's a gorgeous visit annually for us. Congratulations.
Yeah, so well, thank you. It's been